The pink sweatshirt should have been in a donation box or tucked away in a memory chest, anywhere but where it was found. Amanda Hart was just 4 years old when she vanished from her own driveway on a sunny afternoon in 2015, leaving behind only colorful chalk drawings on the pavement. 2 years later, a maintenance worker's disgusting discovery in an abandoned restroom would unlock the darkest secret imaginable. It was the kind of May afternoon that felt like a promise. In the quiet tree-lined suburbs of Portland, Oregon, the sun cast long, warm shadows across manicured lawns, and the air smelled of cut grass and blooming rhododendrons. This was the world of the Hart family in 2015. A world built on the steady foundation of routine and love. A world where the greatest dangers seemed 1,000 miles away. Rodney Hart was an accountant, a man of quiet habits and gentle smiles. His wife, Sabrina, a graphic designer who still took on occasional freelance projects, had channeled much of her creativity into motherhood, orchestrating a life for their 4-year-old daughter, Amanda, that was rich with color and play. Amanda was the vibrant center of their universe. A whirlwind of blonde pigtails and boundless energy, she possessed a curiosity that turned their small backyard into an uncharted wilderness and their driveway into a sprawling canvas. On that particular Friday, the promise of the afternoon felt especially bright. As she would later recount to investigators, her voice hollowed by a grief that was still just a terrifying premonition, Sabrina had decided to do something special. She pulled out her small kit of face paints, a remnant from a long-ago Halloween, and sat with Amanda on the living room floor. With delicate strokes, she transformed her daughter's face. Simple black lines bloomed into whiskers on Amanda's rosy cheeks, and a small dark circle on the tip of her nose completed the look. Amanda giggled, scrunching her nose and pretending to be a cat. It was a perfect, fleeting moment of domestic joy. Sabrina, wanting to capture it, grabbed her phone and snapped a photo. The image was casual, slightly blurry, but it held the essence of the afternoon. Amanda beaming, her blue eyes crinkling at the corners, her favorite pink long-sleeved sweatshirt, a soft splash of color against the brown of the family sofa. It was a photo like any other a mother might take, a digital slip of memory to be filed away. No one could have known it would become a relic, the last image of Amanda Hart before the world tilted off its axis. "Go play in the driveway with your chalk," Sabrina told her, ruffling her hair. "Mommy's going to start dinner. I'll be out in a little bit to check on you." Amanda scampered out the front door, her small sneakers slapping against the concrete. Sabrina went into the kitchen to begin her dinner preparations, her eyes often drifting to the window that overlooked the driveway, where she could see Amanda happily drawing. Just as she was washing some vegetables, her phone rang. It was the client she'd been expecting, calling to discuss a set of brochure proofs. As she would later explain to detectives, her voice thick with a guilt that would become her constant companion. She moved from the kitchen to the small office nook just a few feet away. She needed to be at her laptop to review the files the client had sent. The call required her full attention as they went over layouts and font choices. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but for that brief period, her focus was entirely on the screen in front of her and the voice on the phone. When the call ended, she returned to the kitchen, her mind now on the evening meal, assuming Amanda was still engrossed in her chalk art just outside. 20 minutes later, the familiar sound of Rodney's Subaru pulling into the driveway signaled the end of the work week. He was tired, but looking forward to the weekend, to the easy comfort of home. As he stepped out of the car, he noticed the colorful chalk drawings scattered across the pavement, a vibrant, silent testament to his daughter's afternoon. But the artist herself was gone. He felt a flicker of confusion, nothing more. She was probably inside with Sabrina. He walked into the house, dropping his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. "Honey, I'm home," he called out. Sabrina emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Where's Manda?" he asked, his voice light. Sabrina frowned. "She's in the driveway. I just saw her a few minutes ago." A cold stillness entered the room. They looked at each other, a silent question passing between them. It was a look that would replay in their nightmares for years to come, the exact moment that casual certainty curdled into a sickening dread. They moved as one, bursting out the front door, the screen door slamming shut behind them. "Amanda." Sabrina's voice was sharp, a blade cutting through the placid afternoon air. "Amanda, honey." Rodney's deeper call joined hers, echoing down the quiet street. They checked the backyard, a space they knew as intimately as their own hands. The swing set was still. The sandbox cover was in place. They tore around to the side of the house, peering behind the dense elia bushes where Amanda sometimes liked to hide. Nothing. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at their throats. They ran to the neighbors' houses on either side, their calls growing more frantic. More ragged. Their neighbor, Mr. Henderson, was watering his petunias and shook his head, his face etched with concern. The family across the street was inside, their television audible through an open window. No one had seen a thing. The street, which had felt so safe and familiar just moments before, now seemed vast and menacing, a place of shadows and secrets. The chalk drawings on the driveway were the only evidence that Amanda had been there at all. 10 minutes. It had been only 10 minutes since Rodney had come home, but it felt like a lifetime. The sun was beginning to dip lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful, cruel backdrop to their unfolding horror. Every logical place had been checked. Every call had gone unanswered. The silence that met them was absolute, unnatural. It was Sabrina who finally broke. Her face, pale and streaked with tears, crumpled as she looked at Rodney. "We have to call," she whispered, the words barely audible. He nodded, his own throat too tight to speak. Sabrina fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking so violently she could barely unlock the screen. The 911 call was a choked, fragmented plea. "My daughter, she's gone. She was right here." The first police cruiser arrived in under 5 minutes. Its flashing blue and red lights a jarring intrusion into the serene suburban twilight. The officer who stepped out was young. His expression a practiced mask of calm. He asked questions. Amanda's age, what she was wearing when they last saw her, but his professional demeanor did little to soothe the raw terror that had consumed Rodney and Sabrina. As more cars arrived, the street transformed. The quiet cul-de-sac became a staging ground. The flashing lights casting eerie dancing shadows on the houses. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear. The official search for Amanda Hart had begun. But for her parents, the world had already ended. It had ended in the silence of an empty driveway surrounded by the fading chalk drawings of a little girl who was no longer there. The arrival of the first patrol car was merely the overture. Within the hour, the quiet suburban street had transformed into the nerve center of a major law enforcement operation. The Portland Police Bureau, recognizing the terrifying hallmarks of a potential child abduction, bypassed procedural caution and triggered a full-scale response. A mobile command post, a large sterile-looking RV with an array of antennas bristling from its roof, was parked at the entrance to the cul-de-sac. Its generator humming a low, constant thrum that vibrated through the pavement. Detective Miles Corbin, a man whose weary eyes had seen too many of these scenes, arrived to take the lead. He was methodical, his presence a calm anchor in the swirling storm of panic and procedure. He spoke to Rodney and Sabrina with a practiced gentleness, but his questions were sharp, precise, aimed at stitching. Nor had he thought to look at the license plate. It was just a white van, a ghost in the periphery of his afternoon routine. The information was frustratingly vague, yet it was all they had. A BOLO, a be on the lookout alert, was issued statewide for an older, unmarked white work van. The alert was a double-edged sword. It cast a necessary net, but it also opened the floodgates. For the next 48 hours, dispatch was inundated with calls. A white van was spotted near a park in Beaverton. Another was seen driving erratically on the I-5 corridor. Dozens were pulled over, their drivers questioned, their cargo hold searched. Each stop ended the same way with a cleared driver and a growing sense of futility. The white van was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom that had materialized on a quiet street and dissolved back into the anonymous traffic of the state. While the search raged outside, Rodney and Sabrina faced their own private ordeal inside the walls of their home, which no longer felt like a sanctuary. As is tragically standard in such cases, the investigation necessarily turned inward. The parents are always the first suspects. They were separated and questioned for hours in different rooms of their own house. The familiar space is now feeling alien and accusatory. Detectives had them recount the afternoon's timeline again and again, searching for inconsistencies for any crack in the narrative. 20 minutes, Sabrina repeated, her voice a raw whisper. She was only alone for 20 minutes. Their home became a crime scene. A forensic team moved with quiet impersonal efficiency, dusting for fingerprints, photographing every room, and seizing their computers and phones. It was a violation layered on top of their trauma, a procedural stripping away of their privacy at the moment they felt most vulnerable. While Detective Corbin and his team privately cleared them of any involvement within the first day, the court of public opinion was far less discerning. News reports hungry for an angle framed the story with carefully chosen words. Headlines asked how a child could vanish from her own driveway. Pundits on cable news debated the 20-minute window. Their speculation casting a subtle but persistent shadow of suspicion over the grieving parents. For Rodney and Sabrina, it was a secondary torment, a public judgment that compounded their private hell. The photo Sabrina had taken, Amanda's bright smiling face, the playful cut whiskers painted on her cheeks, became the face of the search. It was a perfect heartbreaking image capturing an innocence that now felt impossibly fragile. It was everywhere, on flyers taped to lampposts, on the screens of gas station pumps, on massive digital billboards overlooking the freeways. The city of Portland and soon the entire state was papered with Amanda's smile. The image resonated deeply, a symbol of every parent's worst fear. A wave of community support swelled in response. Local print shops produced thousands of flyers for free. Many of them parents who saw their own children in Amanda's eyes, organized their own search parties, combing through the dense green belts of Forest Park and the sprawling industrial parks along the Columbia River. They searched with a desperate, hopeful energy, calling Amanda's name into the woods and under bridges, as if their collective will could somehow pierce the silence and bring her home. A week after Amanda's disappearance, with the search yielding nothing but dead ends and exhaustion, a call came into the tip line that sent a jolt of electricity through the command post. A long-haul truck driver refueling at a sprawling rest stop 200 miles south of Portland near the California border claimed he had seen her. He was certain a little girl with blonde pigtails and a pink shirt eating French fries with a scruffy-looking man in his 40s. The man had seemed nervous, the driver reported, and the girl looked sad. The lead was electrifying. It fit the timeline. It fit the direction. Investigators scrambled, contacting California Highway Patrol to secure CCTV footage from the rest stop's convenience store. For 24 agonizing hours, Rodney and Sabrina were sequestered by the FBI, told only that there was a credible sighting. They clung to a desperate, fragile hope, imagining Amanda scared but alive. The emotional whiplash when the news finally came was brutal. The footage was clear. The girl had blonde hair and a pink shirt, but it wasn't Amanda. It was another family on a road trip, their daughter bearing a passing resemblance. The hope that had flared so brightly was extinguished, leaving behind an even deeper, colder darkness. After 3 weeks, the inevitable decision was made. The official large-scale search for Amanda Hart was suspended. The resources were finite and with no new leads, the operation transitioned from an active search to a reactive investigation. The mobile command post, which had been a hub of constant frenetic activity, was driven away. The media vans packed up their satellite dishes and moved on to the next tragedy. The volunteers went back to their lives, leaving behind only stacks of fading flyers. For Rodney and Sabrina, the silence that descended upon their street was more deafening than the chaos had been. The case was now officially cold. Amanda was a file in a detective's drawer, a ghost haunting a quiet suburban house, and her parents were left adrift in a vast, unending void of not knowing. 2 years is a lifetime. It's long enough for seasons to bleed into one another until memories of a specific afternoon blur at the edges. It's long enough for a wound to scar over, the raw, open agony hardening into a dull, permanent ache. For Rodney and Sabrina Hart, 2 years was an eternity spent in a state of suspended animation, trapped in the amber of the day their daughter disappeared. The case of Amanda Hart, once a fixture of the nightly news, had long since receded from the public consciousness. The yellow ribbons tied around the oak trees in their neighborhood had frayed and fallen away. The flyers, with their haunting image of a smiling girl with cat whiskers, had been bleached by the sun and torn down by the wind, replaced by notices for summer festivals and lost pets. The case was officially cold, a term that felt both clinical and cruelly accurate. It lived in a thick manila folder on Detective Miles Corbin's desk. A silent, reproachful stack of paper among the urgent demands of new crimes and new victims. He hadn't forgotten Amanda. No cop ever truly forgets a missing child. But with no leads, no witnesses, and no evidence, there was nothing to pursue. The file was a monument to a dead end. The Hart's house on Sycamore Lane had become a museum of grief. Amanda's room remained untouched. A perfect heartbreaking diorama of a 4-year-old's life. A stuffed giraffe lay on its side on the pillow, its button eyes staring at the ceiling. A half-finished drawing was still taped to the wall. Sabrina would sometimes stand in the doorway, unable to cross the threshold. The silence in the room so absolute it felt like a physical presence. The strain of their shared unspoken sorrow had changed them. The easy laughter that once filled their home was gone, replaced by long stretches of quiet that were heavy with things unsaid. They moved around each other like ghosts in their own lives, bound by a love for their lost daughter, but isolated by the unique shape of their individual grief. Their marriage had become brittle, but it hadn't broken. It was held together by a single shared mission to keep Amanda's memory alive. They became reluctant archivists of their own tragedy. Rodney, the quiet accountant, built a website, findamahart.org. Sabrina, the former designer, ran the Facebook page. Every day she would post. Sometimes it was a new plea for information. Sometimes an old photo of Amanda at the beach or on a swing set. On Amanda's 5th birthday and then her 6th, Sabrina posted the picture of her with the cat whisker face paint, the last photo ever taken. The caption was always the same. 2 years without your smile. We will never stop looking. We love you, Amanda. The page had thousands of followers, a digital community of strangers who offered prayers and shared the posts. Their clicks and comments a faint but constant chorus against the overwhelming silence. While the official investigation lay dormant, Amanda's case thrived in the shadowy corners of the internet. In the digital world, cold cases never die. They are endlessly dissected, debated, and theorized over. On forums with names like Unresolved Mysteries and the Cold Case Collective, Amanda's story became a puzzle to be solved. Anonymous users armed with Google Maps and public records became armchair detectives. They analyzed the 20-minute window, debated the reliability of the elderly neighbor's testimony about the white van, and constructed elaborate theories. One dominant theory which mirrored the private thoughts of Detective Corbin was that the abductor was an amateur, a crime of opportunity. The lack of a ransom demand, the simple snatch and grab nature of the disappearance, and the fact that the scent trail ended so abruptly at the street, all pointed to someone unsophisticated, someone who likely panicked moments after committing the act. This theory was in its own way both more and less terrifying. It suggested the kidnapper wasn't a monster from a movie, but perhaps someone ordinary, someone who lived nearby, their darkness hidden behind a mundane facade. Other theories were darker, more conspiratorial. Some insisted it had to be someone who knew the family, someone who had watched their routine and knew the precise moment to strike. This line of thinking sent ripples of paranoia through Rodney and Sabrina's already shattered world. They would lie awake at night replaying every interaction from that time, scrutinizing the faces of old acquaintances, mail carriers, and distant relatives, searching for a hint of malice they might have missed. For the online sleuths, it was a grim intellectual exercise. For the Harts, it was a form of self-torture, a constant reopening of the wound. They monitored the forums, caught in a painful limbo between the desperate hope that a stranger might uncover a missed clue and the agony of seeing their daughter's life reduced to a collection of speculative bullet points. In the spring of 2017, nearly 2 years after Amanda vanished, a flicker of what seemed like real hope emerged from the most unexpected of places. Detective Corbin received a call from the warden of a state prison in Idaho. An inmate, a career criminal named Marcus Thorne, serving time for armed robbery, was claiming to have information about the Amanda Hart case. He said his former cellmate had confessed to the abduction and had told him where the girl's body was buried. In exchange for the information, Thorne wanted to negotiate a deal for a reduced sentence. A jolt of adrenaline shot through the cold case. False leads were common, especially from prison informants looking for leverage, but every claim had to be investigated. The news was delivered to Rodney and Sabrina with extreme caution. Corbin was careful not to give them false hope, but the very possibility, after 2 years of nothing, was a powerful, terrifying drug. They waited in an agony of suspense as 2 detectives were dispatched to Idaho to interview Thorne. For a week, the Harts lived on the edge of a knife. Thorne's story at first seemed plausible. He provided details about the abduction that had been in the news, weaving them into a narrative about his supposed cellmate. He spoke of a shallow grave in a wooded area east of Portland. The detectives listened, cross-referencing his claims with the case file. But the story soon began to fray. The details were too generic. The timeline was inconsistent. When pressed, Thorne grew evasive. A polygraph test proved inconclusive, but his story was collapsing under its own weight. Finally, after days of questioning, he admitted it was all a lie. He had seen a true crime documentary about the case and concocted the story, hoping to trade a family's tragedy for his own freedom. The news was delivered to Rodney and Sabrina, not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating finality. The cruelty of the hoax was a fresh wound laid upon the old one. It was a stark confirmation of their isolation, a reminder that to the outside world their daughter's disappearance was a story, a piece of currency, a thing to be used. The brief agonizing flare of hope was gone, and the void that remained was deeper and colder than before. The silence returned, more profound and absolute than ever. The catalyst for change often arrives not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet observation in an overlooked place. In April of 2017, that place was a forgotten corner of the Mount Hood National Forest, and the observer was a man named Dave McCann. At 58, Dave was a man who had made a career out of solitude. As a seasonal maintenance worker for the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, his job was to patrol the vast, rugged landscapes of the forest, checking on the remote facilities that dotted the wilderness long before the summer crowds arrived. He was a man of few words, more comfortable with the sigh of wind through pine trees than with human conversation. His face was weathered by years of sun and wind, and his hands were calloused from a lifetime of practical work. His route that week took him down a series of gravel service roads that snaked deep into the forest, paths that were rarely traveled by anyone other than park staff and the occasional adventurous hunter. He was tasked with inspecting the park's more primitive assets, trailhead signs, picnic tables, and the old Spartan restrooms that were relics of a bygone era of park design. It was on a Tuesday morning under a sky the color of washed-out denim that he pulled his dusty green Parks Department truck up to one such facility. It was little more than a concrete blockhouse half swallowed by overgrown salal bushes miles from any designated campground. The air here was different, heavy, still and smelling of damp earth and decay. Few people ever came this far. Inside the restroom was cold and grim. The walls were stained with mildew and the air was thick with the stench of neglect. The facility contained a single archaic piece of plumbing, a white porcelain squat toilet set flush with the tiled floor. It was a design rarely seen anymore, a holdover from the 1960s. And it was completely clogged. A pool of stagnant, murky water had backed up, spilling over the porcelain lip and onto the grimy floor. Dave let out a weary sigh, the sound echoing flatly in the concrete chamber. Vandals, he thought, or just carelessness. It was a familiar problem in these remote outposts. He retrieved his tools from the truck, a long, heavy-duty plumber's snake, and a pair of thick rubber gloves. Kneeling on the damp floor, he began the unpleasant task of clearing the blockage. He fed the snake into the drain, twisting and pushing, but it met a soft, unyielding resistance. It wasn't the usual wad of paper towels or a plastic bottle. It felt dense, fibrous. After several minutes of fruitless effort, he switched tactics. He reached for a long hooked rod he used for dislodging larger debris. Reaching deep into the drain hole, he felt the hook catch on something substantial. He pulled, grunting with the effort. The blockage shifted, and with a final forceful tug, he dislodged a heavy, sodden bundle. It came free with a sickening slurp, trailing murky water as he dragged it onto the tiled floor. At first, it was just a formless, dripping mass. But as Dave began to untangle it with the end of the rod, the colors started to emerge from beneath the grime. A pale, sickly pink, a muted, washed-out blue. He realized with a jolt that it was clothing. He used the rod to carefully unfurl the largest piece. It was a small long-sleeve sweatshirt, its pink fabric now faded and discolored from its long immersion. Beneath it was a pair of what looked like children's blue shorts. The sight was unsettling enough, but it was the final discovery that made the hairs on Dave's arms stand on end. Wrapped tightly inside the sweatshirt, as if it had been deliberately placed there to add weight and ensure it sank, was a tiny pair of girls' underwear. The deliberate nature of the bundle was what struck him as profoundly wrong. This wasn't an accident. This was an act of concealment, a desperate and sinister attempt to dispose of something. The items were clearly a child's, and the image of them being methodically stuffed down a toilet in this desolate, forgotten place, sent a chill down his spine. He stood up, backing away from the pathetic, dripping pile on the floor, his mind racing. He was a man who kept to himself, who didn't follow the news closely, but even he had caught wind of it somewhere along the way. A little girl, a pink shirt, a disappearance that had gripped the state. The memory was hazy, a fragment from a headline seen years ago, but it was there, nagging at the edge of his consciousness. He looked at the faded pink sweatshirt again. Something clicked. He knew he couldn't just throw this away. This was something more. He walked back to his truck, his boots leaving wet prints on the dusty ground. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, the silence of the forest pressing in on him. Then he picked up his official radio and called the county sheriff's office. A deputy, a young man named Peterson, responded to the call. He drove the long winding service road, his patrol car kicking up a plume of dust. When he arrived, Dave was waiting for him by the restroom, his face grim. Peterson was initially unimpressed, expecting a routine report of vandalism. But when Dave led him inside and he saw the small soiled pile of clothing on the floor, his demeanor changed. He recognized, as Dave had, that this was not ordinary trash. The deliberate bundling, the location, the fact that it was children's clothing. It all felt wrong. Following protocol, he carefully photographed the scene before using evidence bags to collect the sweatshirt, the shorts, and the tiny pair of underwear. He took a brief statement from Dave, thanked him and drove back towards civilization. The small wet bundle of evidence resting on the passenger seat like a terrible secret. Back at the sheriff's station, the evidence bags were logged and placed on a desk in the squad room. It was there that they caught the eye of Detective Miles Corbin. He had been transferred from Portland to the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office a year prior, seeking a quieter pace, but he had never let go of the hard case. It was the one that had burrowed deepest under his skin. He walked over, drawn by the sight of the small pink shirt through the clear plastic. He picked up the evidence log, read the description. Clothing child-sized, recovered from clogged toilet, meant Hood NF. A jolt went through him, a surge of adrenaline and a cold wave of dread. He didn't need to see the file. He remembered the photo perfectly. He strode back to his office and pulled up the digital cold case file for Amanda Hart. On the screen, the photo from that May afternoon appeared. Amanda smiling with her cat whisker face paint and her pink sweatshirt. Corbin zoomed in on the shirt. He then pulled up the crime scene photos the deputy had just taken. The color was faded, the fabric warped, but there was no doubt. It was the same shirt. After 2 years of absolute soul-crushing silence, the case had just broken wide open. 2 years after their world had been shattered, Rodney and Sabrina Hart received the knock on the door they had simultaneously prayed for and feared above all else. It was just after dusk. Detective Corbin stood on their porch, his face etched with a gravity that told them this was not a routine check-in. He was accompanied by a victim advocate from the FBI. They invited the detectives in, their hearts pounding in their chests. The air in the living room was thick with unspoken questions. Corbin was gentle, his voice low and steady. He didn't want to give them false hope, but he couldn't shield them from the truth. He explained what had been found, where it had been found, and why he was there. He laid out a series of high-resolution photographs on their coffee table. The faded pink sweatshirt, the blue shorts, the tiny underwear, all laid out on a sterile blue cloth in a forensics lab. Sabrina let out a small strangled gasp and sank onto the couch, her hand flying to her mouth. Rodney stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the images. Sabrina reached out a trembling finger and pointed at the sweatshirt. "That's hers," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It had a small tear on the cuff. I sewed it with white thread." Corbin zoomed in on one of the photos on his tablet. There on the left cuff was a small, neat line of white stitching, almost invisible, but undeniably there. It was the confirmation they needed, and the one they had dreaded. The clothes were Amanda's. The discovery was a shockwave that tore through the quiet grief they had learned to live with. The cold case was instantly violently active again. The fragile peace they had constructed over 2 years was obliterated, and they were thrown back into the maelstrom of uncertain hope and profound, terrifying fear. Their daughter, who had existed for 2 years as a ghost in a photograph, was suddenly real again, her presence tangible in the form of a few pieces of faded waterlogged cloth pulled from a toilet in the middle of a dark forest. The silence had been broken, but the sound that replaced it was the thunderous, terrifying beat of a case that was no longer cold. The forensic confirmation that the clothes belonged to Amanda Hart acted like a defibrillator on the heart of the cold case. The Oregon State Police Crime Lab went to work with a renewed sense of urgency. While the prolonged immersion had destroyed any usable DNA from the garments themselves, the fabric's condition told its own story. The extreme fading and degradation of the synthetic fibers were consistent with being submerged in cold, stagnant water for a significant period. Experts estimated the clothes had been in the toilet for at least a year, but likely not the full 2 years since Amanda's disappearance. This was a crucial piece of the puzzle. It created a new, more recent timeline. The person who had taken Amanda had returned to dispose of this evidence long after the initial crime, suggesting a continued connection to the area and a lingering paranoia. The stupid kidnapper theory, once a speculative whisper in online forums, now became a central pillar of the renewed investigation. A sophisticated predator, investigators reasoned, would have burned the clothes or buried them deep in the forest, not attempted to flush them down a toilet where they were almost guaranteed to cause a blockage. This pointed to an offender who was impulsive, unsophisticated, and prone to panic, the same profile they had considered 2 years earlier. But now they had a new powerful piece of information, a geographic anchor. The investigation, which had once been a sprawling, directionless search across the state, now had a focal point. The vast, rugged wilderness of Mount Hood National Forest. Detective Corbin's team began the monumental task of re-examining every piece of information from the original 2015 investigation. Viewing it all through this new geographic lens, they pulled the files on every person of interest, every tip, every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius of Portland and began cross-referencing their histories for any connection, no matter how tenuous, to the national forest. Did they camp there? Did they have family in the area? Did their cell phone ping off a tower nearby in the last 2 years? It was a painstaking search for a needle in a haystack the size of a mountain range. Weeks turned into a month. The initial adrenaline rush began to fade, replaced by the familiar grind of investigative work. Then they got a hit. It wasn't from a new tip, but from the dusty archives of the original case file, a man named Frank Miller. In 2015, Miller had lived just 3 blocks from the Hart family. He had been on the list of neighbors to be interviewed, a routine check. The original report described him as a quiet, socially awkward man in his late 30s who worked odd jobs as a handyman. He had a minor criminal record from his early 20s, a couple of trespassing charges, nothing violent. During his initial interview, he had been nervous and evasive with no solid alibi for the afternoon. Amanda disappeared, but with no evidence linking him to the crime, he had been dismissed as just another strange neighbor, one of many loose threads in a case full of them. Now, running his name through the new search parameters, a critical detail emerged. Frank Miller's deceased grandparents had owned a small, dilapidated cabin on a private plot of land deep within Mount Hood National Forest. The property records confirmed its location less than 5 miles down a series of logging roads from the remote restroom where Dave McCann had found the clothes. It was the kind of connection that made the hair on a detective's neck stand up. A further check revealed another crucial fact. Miller had abruptly moved out of his Portland apartment 6 months after Amanda's disappearance, relocating to a small, economically depressed town in eastern Oregon, effectively dropping off the grid. The pieces began to slot into place with a sickening click. A quiet loner living blocks away from the victim. A history of trespassing. A family cabin providing a hidden isolated location within the new geographic focus area. A sudden move after the crime. It was a chain of circumstantial evidence, but it was the strongest one they had. The investigation shifted its full weight onto Frank Miller. A team of plainclothes officers was dispatched to the small eastern Oregon town where Miller now lived. They found him working as a handyman for a local motel, living alone in a small rundown rental house. They began quiet surveillance, observing his routines. He was a creature of habit, a ghost in his own life. He went to work, came home, and rarely interacted with anyone. He fit the profile of an opportunistic offender, a man living with a terrible secret, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. While Miller was being watched, Corbin's team secured a search warrant for the family cabin in Mount Hood. The warrant was granted based on the new evidence, and a team of investigators and forensic specialists made the long drive up the same gravel roads Dave McCann had traveled. The cabin was exactly as the records described, a small ramshackle structure slowly being reclaimed by the forest. It was dusty, filled with old furniture covered in mildew sheets, and smelled of rot and time. It looked as if no one had been there in years. The team conducted a meticulous search. They used black lights to check for biological evidence and combed every inch of the dusty floorboards. For hours, they found nothing. The place seemed clean. Then, one of the younger detectives, remembering Miller's handyman profession, decided to check the crawl space beneath the cabin. He pulled up a loose floorboard in a back bedroom closet, the wood groaning in protest. He shone his flashlight into the dark, musty space below, and there, nestled in the dirt next to a stack of old newspapers, was a small, brightly colored object. He carefully retrieved it. It was a plastic hair clip shaped like a cartoon cat. It was the kind of small, cheap accessory a little girl would love, the kind that could easily fall from a pigtail and be forgotten. The hair clip was carefully bagged and photographed. That evening, Detective Corbin paid another visit to Rodney and Sabrina Hart. He showed Sabrina the photo of the clip on his tablet. Her breath caught in her throat. Amanda had one just like that, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was her favorite. She was wearing it the day she couldn't finish the sentence. It was the final piece they needed. The arrest was swift and silent. The next morning, as Frank Miller was leaving his house for work, 2 unmarked cars boxed in his pickup truck at the end of his driveway. He offered no resistance, his face a mask of pale, dawning horror. He knew why they were there. In the sterile gray interrogation room back in Portland, Miller's composure crumbled almost immediately. He was not a hardened criminal capable of withstanding the psychological pressure of a murder investigation. He was a weak, frightened man who had been living in terror for 2 years. He started with denials, his voice thin and ready. He hadn't seen Amanda. He didn't know anything. But the detectives were patient. They laid out the evidence piece by piece on the metal table between them. A map showing the proximity of his old apartment to the Hart's home. A photo of the family cabin. A map showing its proximity to the restroom where the clothes were found. And finally a large glossy photograph of the small cat-shaped hair clip. When he saw the hair clip, something inside Frank Miller broke. A low, guttural sob escaped his lips. He slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands, and the confession began to pour out of him, a torrent of shame, fear, and horrific detail. It was an impulse, he said, a dark thought that had flickered in his mind. And on that sunny afternoon had flared into an unstoppable urge. He saw Amanda playing alone in the driveway, so small and vulnerable. He didn't plan it. He just did it. He pulled his van over, scooped her up before she could even scream, and drove. He drove to the one place he knew no one would ever look, the old family cabin in the mountains. He recounted the next 2 days in a choked, fragmented narrative. He had kept her in the cabin, confused and terrified himself by what he had done. He saw the news reports on a small battery-powered television, saw Amanda's smiling face on the screen, and the panic escalated. He admitted to assaulting her. On the second day, she tried to run. She got out the cabin door and started screaming. He chased her, tackled her, and put his hand over her mouth to silence her. In his terror of being caught, he held on too long. He didn't mean to kill her, he insisted, his sobs now racking his body. It was an accident. He just wanted her to be quiet. After she was dead, he buried her body in a shallow grave deep in the forest, a place he knew from his childhood. He kept her clothes, hiding them in the cabin, a terrible secret souvenir. A year later, consumed by paranoia that someone might stumble upon the cabin and find some trace of what he'd done, he drove back up to the mountains. He retrieved the clothes, intending to bury them as well, but couldn't bring himself to go back to the grave site. Instead, he drove to the remote restroom, a place he knew was rarely used, and tried to flush them away, a final foolish act of a panicked and guilty mind. The confession was complete. Frank Miller agreed to lead the investigators to where he had buried Amanda. The next morning, a solemn procession of law enforcement vehicles made its way deep into the forest. Miller, shackled and wearing an orange jumpsuit, led them through the dense undergrowth until he stopped at a large moss-covered fallen log. There, he whispered, pointing to a patch of disturbed earth. The recovery team went to work with shovels and brushes. It didn't take long. They found Amanda's remains, bringing a final devastating end to a 2-year search. The news was delivered to Rodney and Sabrina, a confirmation that closed the door on hope and opened a new, deeper chamber of grief. Their daughter had been found, but she was never coming home. The trial of Frank Miller was a somber, procedural affair that stood in stark contrast to the raw, chaotic emotion of the preceding 2 years. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, members of the community who had volunteered in the search, and the hollow-eyed figures of Rodney and Sabrina Hart, who sat in the front row, a silent, unmovable presence. Miller, looking smaller and more pathetic than the monster he had become in the public imagination, rarely looked up from the defense table. His defense team attempted to paint him as a victim of his own disturbed mind, a pathetic loner with profound social deficiencies who had been overwhelmed by an impulse he couldn't control. They argued that Amanda's death, while tragic, was not premeditated murder, but a case of manslaughter, the accidental result of a panicked attempt to silence a child. They presented psychiatric experts who testified to Miller's low IQ and his history of social isolation. They tried to frame the narrative around his weakness, not his malice. The prosecution, however, systematically dismantled this portrayal. They presented the jury with a clear, chilling timeline of calculated actions. The abduction itself was an act of predatory violence, not a simple mistake. The decision to take Amanda to a remote, family-owned cabin was not impulsive, but strategic. The 2 days he held her captive were a period of sustained terror, and the final act, the suffocation, was presented not as an accident, but as the ultimate act of self-preservation by a man desperate to escape the consequences of his crimes. The prosecution's most powerful piece of evidence was Miller's own confession. His words read back to the court in a flat, dispassionate tone that amplified their horror. The story of the clothes found in the squat toilet became a central theme. The prosecutor, a sharp, articulate woman named Eleanor Vance, used it to demolish the defense's argument of a simple-minded man who panicked. This was not the act of a man who didn't know what he was doing, she argued in her closing statement, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom. This was the act of a man trying to erase his victim to flush away the last traces of a little girl's life. But he failed. His one foolish, arrogant mistake, his belief that he could simply make evidence disappear, is the very reason we are here today. That faded pink sweatshirt pulled from the filth of that forgotten restroom was Amanda Hart's final cry for justice, and it was heard. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. The verdict was read to a courtroom holding its collective breath. Guilty on all counts, including kidnapping and aggravated murder. Frank Miller was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, he glanced for a single moment toward Rodney and Sabrina. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a vacant, hollow emptiness. Justice had been served, but it offered no comfort, only a grim final punctuation to their tragedy. With the trial over, and the truth finally brutally known, Rodney and Sabrina could at last begin the long, arduous process of grieving. The not knowing had been a unique form of torture, a limbo of hope and despair. The certainty of Amanda's fate, while devastating, allowed them to take the first steps onto solid ground, however fractured it might be. They sold the house on Sycamore Lane, unable to live with the ghosts of that sunny afternoon, and moved to a small town on the Oregon coast, seeking the solace of the sea's constant rhythmic roar. The story of Amanda Hart's disappearance and the unlikely clue that solved it became a part of Oregon's history. A cautionary tale passed down through generations of law enforcement and families. The remote Restroom in Mount Hood National Forest was demolished a year after the trial. The concrete structure torn down and the land left to be reclaimed by the forest. The squat toilet, the grim vessel of the case's most crucial clue, was shattered and buried. Nature began its slow work of erasing the scar, covering the concrete foundation with moss and ferns. In a park in their new coastal town, Rodney and Sabrina dedicated a memorial bench to Amanda. It was simple, made of dark wood with a small brass plaque that read, "In loving memory of Amanda Hart. May her light remind us to cherish every moment." The bench overlooked a playground, and sometimes on quiet afternoons they would sit there and watch the children play, their laughter echoing in the salt-tinged air. It was a painful pilgrimage, but a necessary one. They were bearing witness to the life that continued, the life their daughter would never have. The sound of the children's joy didn't erase their sorrow, but it existed alongside it, a reminder that even after the most profound loss, the world keeps turning, and innocence somewhere still exists. The case was closed, the monster was caged, but the silence Amanda left behind would linger forever. A quiet space in their hearts where a little girl's laughter used to be.